Warm greetings to everyone that has joined this fifth, I believe, episode, the third way live with the SG, and special greetings to those that have joined us at ungodly hours, very early in the morning in the Americas, very late at night in many countries in Southeast Asia, Far East Asia, and of course, particular greetings to those who have consistently joined us in those sessions which are always designed to be directed less towards me speaking, but more, as always, towards hearing your voice, your questions, your comments, your critiques, which I will take within the time allocated. I will take, as always, without filters. And of course, through all social media, through comments that you can make, but also, and I insist on this point, through WhatsApp calls that are of course free of charge and that will enable to hear your voice quite literally. And of course, before starting with a few words, as always, of introduction to this episode, let me acknowledge, because it has been some time since we last held one of those sessions, let me acknowledge the team behind the scenes, so those that make it happen, that allow us to have this fraternal space, this open space for us to exchange more directly than we otherwise do. And of course, we will start with Betty Solomon. Betty Solomon, that is, as you have heard, but I must ratify, my assistant, technically, my brains in practice, also the one that makes sure that I follow my schedule with the discipline required. And of course, we have Abdurrahim al-Idrisi, who's here behind the computer, managing the sound, managing the camera, but also, and most crucially, the one that is in charge of communicating all of our endeavors from the OSCE as a collective of sovereign states and organizations, institutions, in terms of technology, that we may become drivers rather than remaining passengers of the technological revolution. And of course, Jim Ochiti, my advisor, but most crucially, the man that, tolerating, of course, my long conversations and consultations with him at any hour of the day and night, is also the one spearheading our efforts in terms of institutional learning and knowledge management, mostly to ensure that as an organization we remain a learning institution that constantly grows, constantly adapts to our world, to the expectations of our countries, and to the expectation of every single one of you that is joining us here. Of course, Hidayat Chilko Paran, my chief of staff, that, as I will tell you in a moment, mistreats me in terms of the trips that he authorizes for me to take, but that is a man of dedication, a man, I dare say, of letters, and a man of engagement. And of course, Dr. Gitahun, my dear advisor for climate action and for climate and action and environmental policies, that is spearheading the efforts that we will present to our member states towards the establishment of an Office of Climate Action and Resilience Enhancement, the Office of CARE, that we may put at the center of all of our efforts the issue not only of climate change and combating climate change, but most crucially, that as we strive to build the third way of development from and by the South, that this may be a ecologically driven development. Of course, Rufi, the extraordinary journalist who decided to join us from the Philippines, to put at the service of the member states these extraordinary efforts to ensure the democratization of our endeavors when it comes to higher education, when it comes to research, when it comes to linking up our university. And of course, we have Annabelle, Annabelle, that in regular circumstances is the one spearheading the democratization efforts in terms of communication, for us to build balanced and inclusive education systems. But that today has taken the role of the extraordinary Pearl, who is in another room dealing with the WhatsApp calls that will be coming, of making sure that I do not confirm my reputation as an interminable speaker and keep in time to give you all the space and the time necessary to ask all possible questions, articulate all possible proposals, and also critiques, because we also learn from critiques. And finally, el estimadísimo doctor Kulsilamko, an extraordinary artist, an extraordinary writer, an extraordinary poet, but also my advisor for heritage, culture, and the arts, that also serves quite brilliantly and informally, but even if it is informal, we must acknowledge it, as the executive producer of those sessions. And of course, as I started by saying, it has been some time since we held one of those sessions. I believe it has been 2 weeks since we haven't held those sessions, those episodes of the Third Way live
Another microphone. No, I just walk this use this one instead of. If you put a message on the back, okay, because I didn't see it. The check will be back. Use. When cannot just the camera. It's what the other voice is. 10 minutes.
Sound in the background. Where is it?
This one from here. Okay, yes, I think everybody should do that. Do that. That's awesome.
One two 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 one two. Camera.
So it's working.
If it's not working, there will not be blinking in here. When I touch it, it will blink. But
Let's try to go back.
So I apologize for this technical problem that we had to face. As you know, technology always fails when we need it the most. But I hope that going forward, we won't have any other technical issues. If we do, please bear with us and be indulgent. But before I continue speaking, let me just double check with the technical team. Is it working? Beautiful. Excellent. So to start from where we left off, and I thank everybody that stayed on during this technical glitch. I was saying that it has been a while since we had one of those episodes of the third way live with the SG. In fact, it has been 2 weeks, I believe. Now, of course, 2 weeks we've lost a bit of our in-house institutional memory and got this technical problem, but aside from this, hopefully this will go well. But the reason we haven't had these sessions in the last 2 weeks is because I was on a mission to Cuba. And I was saying when the audio was off that it was a visit full of insights, full of lessons for me and for the delegation. And of course, it's always delightful to visit Cuba, even though Cuba is currently undergoing a very difficult situation, an extraordinarily difficult situation. And it is going through it, and that is what is most disheartening. Mostly, I will not say entirely, but mostly because of an embargo, what the Cubans call a blockade, that has lasted for over 6 decades. An inhuman endeavor that ultimately harms the Cuban people. And I know that the embargo has been spoken about a lot, and I will not therefore speak about it at great length. But I have personally seen, not only in this visit, but in the more personal sphere, the effects of this embargo on Cuba that is, again, inhumane. Now, of course, this embargo is as well, and this is why I felt it was important to mention it, not only out of solidarity with Cuba, but because it touches the very heart of the issue that we speak about from the OSCE, of building a third way of development that requires a new kind of multilateralism. Because every year, year after year, at the United Nations General Assembly, all countries of the world, with the exception of 2, sometimes 3, vote at the General Assembly of the United Nations to lift the embargo. And yet, this embargo continues, which goes to great length to demonstrate the fundamental need for a new multilateralism. One where there is a genuine democratic exercise of the voice of all nations. But in any event, this trip to Cuba that I undertook was to answer 2 invitations. The first, an invitation in Havana to Casa de las Americas, the House of the Americas, and the second in Santiago de Cuba by the University of Oriente. And both of those invitations were for me to engage and discuss and present this endeavor that is ours collectively. And when I say collectively once more, I do not mean exclusively the Secretariat of the OSCE, but the collective of nations, the collective of peoples, the collective of individuals that we embody. And of course, presenting this collective endeavor of building a third way of development from and by the South for humanity. And I will not repeat everything that I have said in Casa de las Americas or that I said at the university in Oriente. I will rather focus on the lessons that I learned from these engagements. Because Casa de las Americas, which is currently being led by our good friend Abel Prieto, who had joined us during the Festival of the Greater South, a man of culture, an extraordinary writer. Casa de las Americas has played an extraordinary role for the past 65 years as a house of culture to bring together, to make more visible, facilitate collaborations, the arts of all countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And looking at that endeavor, which is a profoundly people-to-people endeavor. I kept thinking about the fact that, and as I've said repeatedly on these episodes and other interventions, our endeavors of South-South cooperation cannot, should not, remain the exclusivity of our governments. This space is essential, but it must be in parallel, accompanied by integration, cooperation, exchange between our peoples. And this passes through two avenues. Culture and the arts of a living, breathing South in all its diversity, and higher education institutions, our researchers, our students. And looking at Casa de las Americas, I kept thinking that perhaps what we ought to do, and this is something we must reflect upon, my dear Kulsi, we must also start perhaps establishing Casas del Gran Sur, houses of the Greater South, regionally, but also in every single country, as cultural hubs to showcase the arts and the artists, the writers, the poets, the dancers, the composers, the musicians of our countries of the Greater South. That we may build a network of exchanges amongst our art. And the second aspect that emerged from that encounter is, as I said, there's two avenues, in my view, that are essential for our people. Culture as a point of encounter of our diversity and our commonality, but also higher education, research. Because as countries, we are very diverse, but we share some systemic challenges and aspirations. And not everything can remain at the OSCE. It must come from within as well. And that we should explore, perhaps, as countries, as universities, the establishment of these Casas del Gran Sur, these houses of the Greater South. But we should also perhaps explore, and this is something that I will, as soon as Monday, because I arrived yesterday, or the day before, I think, we have lost track with the time zone differences, with my Undersecretary General for Research, Evaluation and Foresight, of the establishment within different universities of the South, centers of study or chairs on the Greater South that may generate those sustainable bridges beyond the OSCE Secretariat. Because again, South-South cooperation must, above all, have a foundation in our peoples. Because as I've mentioned in the past, we have a crisis of identity. Where we speak of the South, but most of us do not feel that we belong to the South. And this sense of belonging is when you create those bridges of encounter. But of course, Casa de las Americas, this intervention that I had in Havana, was a more intimate one, with intellectuals, with artists. But after that, of course, the following day, we left for Santiago de Cuba, which is on the other extreme of Cuba, Havana being on the west, and Santiago being in the east. And we did so, we left there by car, which took us about 12 hours if we remove the lunch break. 12 hours to get to Santiago, which also provided us a beautiful opportunity. Beautiful opportunity to see most, not all, but most of the provinces of Cuba, even though in passing. And arriving in Santiago late at night, 8th, I believe. On the 9th in the morning, I had the honor of my life of addressing the National Theatre, the principal theatre of the University of Oriente. Worried, I must confess, that it was mostly going to be professors, but enthused to enter and see that we had, of course, half of the room professors, researchers, but the other half being young people, first-year university students. And I say enthused because just as we need our peoples, South-South cooperation cannot remain the exclusivity of our renowned intellectuals. It must also be spearheaded by our youth, with their proposals, their engagement. And of course, it was a beautiful encounter where we exchanged at great length with the audience. But at one point, and this is what I'd like to raise, because it is something that is quite interesting. At one point, there was a lady in the audience, Professor of Theatre, I believe, that through a zeal of conviction started before opening the floor to all of your questions, critiques, proposals, views, is several things. The first is that we from the South, including the OSCE, we as countries, peoples, individuals, organizations of the Greater South are not against the North in any manner whatsoever, because we do not define ourselves in oppositions. Ours is a vision that unites us, brings us together, a vision that includes a diversity of convictions. Ours is a positive way, a way for certain things, a way for our peoples, a profoundly humanist endeavor, and not merely saying we are against the North, etc. And I am being told it has been 30 minutes. Did you take into account the technical glitch? Okay, I will go faster. But we do not define ourselves against the North. And in fact, I myself would not be who I am without some thinkers from the North. We must take the good, leave aside the bad, but in particular articulate our own way in favor of humanity in its entirety. And that new North is not governments that, at least in theory, have to be accountable to their electorates, to their peoples, that have to have a degree of transparency. No, that other North is these extraordinarily large private companies. And to put things into perspective, and this is something that must be preoccupying, not only for us in the Greater South, but must also be preoccupying in the North, for humanity in its entirety. Because when you look at a company like Apple, that has a market capitalization of $3 trillion, above $3 trillion, which is 4 times the nominal GDP value of Switzerland. When you see that in 2022, a single man, a single individual, was able to undertake a single transaction for $44 billion to purchase one of the platforms we are using, which corresponds to more than double, if my memory doesn't fail me. Well, no, but in any case, it is more than the nominal GDP value of Estonia, almost the nominal GDP value of Jordan. That this same man owns today 62% of all the satellites in orbit. You start realizing that there is a fundamental structural problem that we must consider. In this structural problem, and again, I emphasize structural, the issue is not about an individual. We do not quarrel with individuals. We care about the underlying drivers and structures. And we have to reflect if we are to collectively build a third way of development from and by the South for humanity. We must reflect on three aspects when looking at this new North. And that is, on the one hand, first and foremost, this excessive concentration of power that is not accountable. And we must start articulating collectively, North and South alike, mechanisms of balance. The second, of course, is looking at that excessive concentration of power that is accompanied by an excessive concentration of wealth, is matters such as the taxation systems that we have, that remain outdated, despite the fact that we have known for years that they need to be reformed. Because most of those giants, not all of them, are giants in the technology sphere. And the truth is that I know, like most do, that these giants, these social media giants, do most of their funds, or a lot of their funds and revenues, through ads, through selling our data in the South. Yet not a single one of our countries, or some of them, but the majority, say Ethiopia, for instance, say Ghana, for instance, say Colombia, for instance, say Thailand, for instance, do not receive any payment in taxes from those companies because they do not have offices in our countries. And this dematerialization of the way of doing business and transactions requires us to reflect as countries on the importance of articulating, as was proposed by the African group at the United Nations last year, to articulate new mechanisms, multilateral mechanisms of taxation, of regulation of this digital sphere. But of course, and most importantly, it emphasizes the point that we from the OSCE keep reiterating and working daily upon, that is, that we as countries must have an endeavor, must have strategies and plans accompanied by concrete action to develop our own technologies, our own homegrown technologies, including, I dare say, bringing our resources together, even regionally, to have our own satellites, to not depend constantly on costly vendors, and at the same time stimulate our economies. But we have talked about this on several occasions. Therefore, and I was told, and I see Annabelle gesticulating with her eyes to say that I must come to a close. But there was another aspect of this visit that was very interesting for me, where I had the pleasure of dining at the home of a friend who is an extraordinary historian, extraordinary intellectual. And what was extraordinary about that dinner, aside from the pleasure of the exchange, was that his home is not particularly luxurious. It is not a very fancy home. But what makes his home so very extraordinary, what made that dinner so very extraordinary, is that the dinner that we had, with the exception of the meat that we ate, everything in that dinner, that extraordinarily delicious dinner, was harvested from his own small garden. Nutritional, delicious, sustainable, and less expensive for him. Which brings us back to a recurring theme, because I bring this small example of this individual. But it goes to the heart, when taken at the national level, of what we ought to be able to do in terms of achieving food sovereignty. Of realizing that perhaps, yes, we do not have necessarily the capacity to export. Not all countries have the capacity to export their agricultural produce, but we certainly do have the capacity to consume locally, to create circular economies. And I will not speak about food sovereignty again, because we have spoken about it repeatedly. But seeing this, because I was wondering, how do you bring this at the national level? Of course, there are some strategies from the architectural, from the agricultural aspect, of redirecting our agriculture from agriculture destined for exports to agriculture destined for consumption by our people, for the nutrition of our people, which also reduces our costs in terms of imports. But that we must, if we are to speak of a third way of development, we must from the South also start to rethink urbanism. Rethinking urbanism, not only in the sense of architecture, but also the materials that we use for our housing. I'm aware of a very interesting NGO in Argentina called FOISE that endeavors, for instance, in the case of Argentina, which gets quite cold, to build what it calls sustainable and just housing by using materials in the building of houses that are weatherized, which means that these individuals, especially in the poorer communities, do not need to use heating as much during the winter. So rethinking materials, but to go back to this issue of agriculture, and as I was in Cuba, but this is true in most of our countries, looking at our cities and looking at the trees within our cities. They are beautiful, but they're also, aside from the aesthetics, useless. We should start considering means, through appropriate trees, of finding beautiful but fruitful trees that can contribute to this endeavor of consuming more local, of producing more nutritional foods for our people. And of course, I will hear those that say, yes, but it's not practical in the city. Well, Valencia has done it in Spain, with orange trees in the city, which are beautiful, but also fruitful. But aside from orange trees, you can imagine that in many of our countries, you could start producing avocado trees that can either be harvested as part of the city council endeavors or can just be left to individuals to pick up. So rethink, as if we do not put them in the trees, creating green forests, food forests within neighborhoods. So we must, I do not have recipes as always, rethink urbanism as part of a third way of development. But of course, I am being told that I have spoken for too long, and as always, the endeavor that is ours is to give you the floor, that you may ask your questions, articulate your proposals, put forth your critiques, because a third way of development will only be achieved when it is a collective endeavor, and you must be the protagonists of this endeavor, with the OSC as the platform, the OSC there to accompany, to accelerate, but the protagonists will never be the Secretariat members of the OSC. They will be our youth, our universities, our artists, our intellectuals, in addition to our governments. But to conclude my intervention, this visit to Cuba made me remember a poem that is extraordinary by Mario Benedetti. Mario Benedetti, extraordinary journalist, poet from Uruguay, that has a long poem that says, El Sur también existe. The South also exists. And I advise everyone to read that poem. But I would like to mention only some fragments of this poem that are extraordinary, in which he says, con su esperanza dura, el sur también existe. Con su fe veterana, el sur también existe. Y hay quienes se desmueren, y hay quienes se desviven, y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible, que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. Which, to translate more or less, is that with its enduring hope, the South also exists. With its veteran faith, the South also exists. And there are those that die for it. And there are those who live, go out of their way in the endeavor. And this way, amongst themselves, amongst everyone, they achieve what was once believed to be an impossible, that the entire world may know that the South also exists. And this is the spirit of our endeavors. And this is why that we may, amongst ourselves, amongst everyone, ensure that the South also exists. That we now pass on to the other segment of this episode to read any of the questions that you may have for us at this particular stage. And of course, please remember that you can ask questions on all the social media platforms of the OSC, but you may also call through WhatsApp, which I hope you will do, in order to articulate your vision. Let us have a look. I see a question by Evans Nate. How does the OSC plan to strategically invest in emerging technologies such as green energy, sustainable construction materials become catalysts for growth and industrialization across member states? That is a very, very important question. And of course, one that we could spend hours discussing. And my intention here is not to monopolize the floor, but address the general lines of an answer to this question. And that would be, first and foremost, that the OSC has multiple lines of action. First, accompanying member states in their own endeavors, own national priorities to achieve this what we call ecologically driven development that goes by emerging technologies, renewable energies, but also working with our member states. And this goes in the larger endeavor of industrialization that is ours, of generating in our development endeavors, and this is also where universities are involved, a paradigm shift in terms of how do we build our houses, what materials do we use in those endeavors of industrialization, but also in what sectors do we strategically invest. And in what sectors we strategically invest goes by a determination, an overarching strategy at the regional and global greater south level of saying it is no longer enough to produce in our countries. We must also transform within our countries. And this goes by the utilization, because you mentioned emerging technologies such as green energy, with the critical minerals that are in our soil, without which you would have no, or you would have fewer renewable energy sources, technologies to be used. And working with our partners to ensure that in addition to the export of those critical minerals, we can also get and ensure their transformation. But this is on a very general level. And your question, Evans, goes to the heart of the concrete. Because it is true that to undertake this, we need a paradigm shift, we need strategies, but we also need, crucially, as you identify, finance. And in this regard, the OSCE has two initiatives ratified by our General Assembly, by our member states, that serves this purpose. The first is the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club, the world's only union of sovereign borrowers, sovereign debtors, so that we may, on the one hand, achieve greater debt relief, so that our countries have greater fiscal space in order to invest in those critical sectors of renewable energies, of green industrialization, sustainable construction. Because, mind you, 3.3 billion people in the world live in countries where the governments have no other choice than to spend more on debt service than they can on education or health, let alone sustainable construction. But of course, debt relief alone and greater fiscal space, whilst necessary and crucial, is only a very small part of the equation. And in this regard, the club also serves as a platform for our member states, and I'll be happy to elaborate on its mechanism if you deem it necessary, so feel free to push me again in the comments and questions, but as a platform for our member states to access fresh, highly concessional, that is low-cost finance for our multi-dimensional development through collateral creation, through collective finance. And of course, this new finance coming from the club, which is identified in the bylaws of the club, must go to 6 strategic sectors that go in line with your question. Finance to balanced and inclusive education, no development without education, but education that is transformed in order to be transformative. In integral health, within the framework of One Health, that recognizes the interdependence between the health of flora, fauna, and human beings. In infrastructure, to connect our peoples better, so that next time that I have to go to Latin America from Africa, I do not have to travel for 38 hours in order to get there, so that we can have greater South-South cooperation. But infrastructure also nationally, that also in the medium to long term reduces a lot of our costs in those countries. In high value added industrialization and endogenous technologies, which is a crucial aspect for our countries, and this industrialization must include precisely what you mentioned, which is sustainable construction materials companies, technologies, in order to transform our development models. And finally, last but not least, investing through the club in renewable energy sources. So this is one of the initiatives that the OSCE has, spearheaded by our member states, supported by the Secretariat. But in parallel to that, the OSCE later this year, with the approval of the member states, will be launching its financial subsidiary. So aside from negotiating with creditors for fresh finance that is highly concessional directed to those sectors, will also launch its financial subsidiary, which will be, if you will, the OSCE's own multilateral development bank, but with a unique feature in that 100% of the shares will be owned by the OSCE as an organization, which will mean, in effect, that through this modality where 100% of the shares are owned by the organization, that we will preserve the democratic nature of the bank, of this financial subsidiary, because it will mean that the major decisions will be taken at the General Assembly, where it is one country, one vote. And precisely part of the role of this financial subsidiary, the OSCE Multilateral Development Bank, if you will, is threefold. Invest in socially and ecologically responsible projects within member states that contribute to their sustainable economic development. And from there, generate funds for the country, but also generate funds for the subsidiary that it may then start to provide what our constitutive charter identifies as solidary or solidarity-based financing to the member states in those same areas crucial for this transformation to which we aspire. I hope that I have answered broadly your question, but do not hesitate once more to push me on certain points. I see another question by Southern Voice that says, thanks a lot for speaking about sanctions on Cuba. What other ways do you foresee to resolve international differences in the new form of multilateralism? Or how to coexist with the differences? Well, Southern Voice, this is crucial, but it is also a matter that we could build as a dissertation. And as I've said repeatedly in the past, I do not have, and it is not desirable to have, recipes. We must work together to articulate this future to which we aspire, including in terms of multilateralism. But what I can say at this stage is, first, when I speak of a new multilateralism, what do we mean by it? And what we mean by that new multilateralism is a multilateralism that is directed by three major principles that may seem simple, but whose consequences are profound. The first is equality amongst parties. And instinctively from the South, in the case of Cuba, is a good point in terms of the votes that happen every year at the United Nations to lift the embargo, including European Union countries voting for the lifting of the embargo. Is equality amongst parties. We know from the South instinctively that the multilateralism that we have is more like, is an Orwellian multilateralism in the sense of Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And what we need is genuine equality amongst countries. There is no small country, there is no big country. Every country's voice matters. The second is equity in relations. And to be provocative, I would say a multilateralism, and we are trying to embody this at the OSCE, a multilateralism where we believe in that from each country, according to their ability, and to each country, according to their need. And this maxim was truly demonstrated in terms of its necessity during the pandemic, when our friends at the IMF issued $600 billion worth of special drawing rights, SDRs, to support countries because of the exogenous economic shock of COVID. Only 7% of those funds went to the countries of the continent of Africa. Only 8% went to the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Most of it went to those that needed it the least. And finally, we need a multilateralism profoundly committed to solidarity rather than charity. Solidarity practiced horizontally and not charity practiced vertically. Because again, as I've said in the past, and I ratify, charity is gifting away the leftovers. Solidarity is sharing the meal with an understanding that we share a destiny. And of course, these three principles we seek to embody at the OSCE. Equality amongst parties. The OSCE does not have, for instance, smaller committees of countries that decide on behalf of all others. It is an entirely democratic exercise of one country, one vote. Equity in relations, where some of our programs and endeavors at the OSCE do not benefit all the countries, because our countries have different needs in different areas. But our countries are engaged in an understanding that in this area, our countries need, other countries need support, and in this one, our countries need more. And solidarity, because our endeavors seek to address, and this is where, because you asked me, Southern Voice, you asked me mostly about how to resolve the differences and coexist in differences. And where I am going with this is we need to change structural drivers of those conflicts, of those issues. And the first goes by what we were mentioning earlier. As countries, we cannot only be complaining about the status quo. We must take our responsibilities and invest strategically to reduce our dependencies, which is the condition sine qua non for us to be able to sit as equals at the table. As I often say, if you cannot step away from a negotiation, it is not a negotiation, it is a terrible beating. And so long as we are not able to feed our own people, we are not able to generate our own energy even at the regional level, then we cannot expect successful negotiations at the multilateral level, because we cannot step out, because we are dependent. So addressing the structural drivers of our dependencies. But the other is also coming out, of some frameworks and articulating new proposals to resolve differences. And this goes through the establishment of alternative, parallel institutions within the South. Financial institutions, dispute resolution institutions of arbitration amongst countries. But most crucially, what I would say, so as not to spend too much time on this particular question, but again, feel free to push me more if I haven't answered properly your question, is also recognizing that as countries of the South, what we must also be undertaking is the endeavor of recognizing that it is through difference that universality is built. Not despite, not universality cannot be an attempt to erase differences. And this is why the endeavor from the OSCE, of this third way of development, does not seek to be a third model. We must have a common direction, a common vision, some universal principles, but they must be translated in accordance with national priorities and ideologies. And that now is not the time for our countries to bicker about whether we are left-wing, right-wing, center, up or down. That in this encounter of difference, so long as some basic principles and common direction are respected, that this is how you build universality. This is how you build the future. So I hope I have answered your question. Feel free to tell me if I haven't. I see that we have a question on WhatsApp from the Netherlands, which is quite long, but I'll still try to read it out. The African Union and other international organizations have lots of seminar and conferences that are promoting partnerships to promote youth programs and skilling. The past 2 weeks, these events have taken place without me seeing the OSCE presence, whether in Kigali, Accra, Addis, Algiers. What programs and partnerships is OSCE undertaking with the youth in AU member states in upskilling if they are not collaborating with these agencies? I would also like to ask that I could send a proposal to spearhead and liaise with agencies focused on South development, as well as request for audience for such. And that is from Sydney Malboa. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Sydney, for this extensive question, which covers several areas that I would first like to address. And the first is, let us start from the premise. The OSCE is unwavering in its commitment and in its conviction that the future will lie in the confederation of efforts. And we always stand ready to collaborate with all actors, with all agencies that share the principles that are ours. In particular, when you are speaking of organizations, intergovernmental, supranational, of a regional nature, because we believe that greater African integration reinforces South-South cooperation, and that South-South cooperation reinforces African as well as Latin American integration. Now, of course, at the risk of provoking, I am not a firm believer in seminars and conferences. And I do not mean this as a slight in any way. But as someone that considers himself still relatively young, I do feel at times, dear Sydney, that we convene conferences, we convene summits, we convene seminars, we spend extensively, either as individuals or as institutions, to organize those conferences, those seminars, to come and discuss and debate things that we have already discussed and debated and agreed upon years prior. Yani, we are entering in a dynamic where at times I do feel, even though I recognize the importance of face-to-face meetings, I do recognize the importance of confederating, of dialogue, of talking, but there must be something concrete that comes out of it, at least an objective. And the truth is, I do feel, and this is why the OSCE does not spend excessive time on on seminars and conferences, doesn't convene a lot of them, that ultimately we are at times trying to convince the already convinced that they ought to be convinced of what they are already convinced. The question that should be ours, because you speak of youth, because you speak of upskilling. What we need, I dare say we, as youth, is action. Not action divorced from reflection. That would be mere activism. No, but we have already agreed on certain principles. We have already agreed on certain objectives, and we have even developed methodologies. The question is to go at the heart of the issue and act. And whereas, of course, the OSCE is always, at all times, ready to collaborate with all other agencies, all other organizations, all other institutions. I see that we have a question saying that they can't hear me. Can you just double check? That all other endeavors, all other questions, we stand ready to collaborate. But we are determined to ensure that this is action-oriented. And a lot of the endeavors that we at the OSCE have spearheaded in this regard is, well, we have several, and I won't bore you with the details, but in fact, if you do contact us by email, we can send you a more exhaustive list of these programs. But the one I would like to emphasize is the Freire program, the framework to reinforce exchanges between youth and regions through education. Freire, in honor of Paulo Freire, the great educationalist from Brazil that wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Freire is basically a student and academic mobility scheme across our countries. It is not yet fully in force. We have been working on it in this regard. And we hope that before the end of this year, the member states will approve the final framework with the corresponding action items. But let me give you the vision and then the concrete steps that have been taken towards that vision. Is to recognize that we need to build links between our peoples. When a young person from Ghana goes to study in Colombia, you have a sustainable bridge built between Colombia and Ghana that will outlast any political changes. But the second, regarding upskilling, is this also makes learning more relevant. When a young person from Cambodia, a country with a tropical climate, shouldn't have to go to Canada at minus 17 degrees Celsius to study tropical medicine, but should be able to go and study, say, for example, in a country like Cuba, because it is more relevant. Now, the full framework has not been fully launched because the complexities are colossal, as you can imagine. But we have already taken some steps in this direction, such as launching a postgraduate scholarships program for all citizens of member states, youth, to go and study. 400 slots have been achieved, to go and study in Brazil, their postgraduate studies, and in an endeavor as full scholarships, in an endeavor to upskill and build links and enrich these opportunities. But so this is one program that is an example of this. But the other part that I would like to mention, and I had this conversation with the All Africa Students Union, their Secretary General, Peter, who's an extraordinary leader. Sometimes I even call him my Secretary General. And we had this conversation, I think, last year, because they are associate members of the OSCE, that I do not believe either in organizing youth summits or youth consultations, for a very simple reason. When we do this, we basically say, let the grown-ups speak at the summit, and we will create a space for you to talk amongst yourselves. No, where we need to ensure that our youth is in the room where it matters, alongside all the other institutions. Just as there is a sector that is crucial, which is the sector of the private sector, the academic sector, the government sector, there's also the student and youth sector. And they must be in the room at the same level as others. And we have been doing this at the OSCE. And this is why, again, as an associate member of the OSCE, we have the All Africa Students Union. So I hope that I have answered your question, Sydney. If I haven't, feel free to push me on it, because I also see that we're running out of time, partly due because of the technical issue that we had faced. Let me see if we have anything else. Well, I do not see as of yet any other question, unless I'm mistaken, any other question or comment, which matches more or less our regular schedule. But perhaps let me add by saying that, because it appears to me crucial, as we're speaking of action and what is the OSCE doing about it? And I think this is crucial. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe firmly, without wavering, that the OSCE is an action development-oriented organization. In addition to articulating new visions and perspectives and reflections. That being said, I do think that we have become so enveloped, collectively, all of us, with the individualism of our current development models, that we have forgotten what collective action means. And collective action does not mean, cannot mean, many people doing the same thing at the same time, nor can it mean the OSCE Secretariat doing everything. Not because we don't want to. We are ready to take on, as we already have and will continue to, all the responsibilities that befall us. But the reason I am raising this is that collective action must be a multi-pronged, collective, coordinated, decided and purposeful struggle towards a common objective. Many people doing different things at different times to serve the same ideal. And whereas, of course, the OSCE is, in my view, the most effective platform that we have as countries today, and that its role is essential, I also believe that each one of our countries, each one of our youth unions and student unions, each one of our workers' unions, each one of our universities has a role to play beyond what the OSCE does. That this third way of development cannot, will not be decreed nor implemented from the OSCE Secretariat. And that this endeavor between OSCE and our countries and student unions, etc., must be inscribed within this understanding of collective action, of different people doing different things at different times to serve the same ideal. And that this third way of development that we promote and that we defend from the OSCE is one that also requires your proactive involvement from wherever you are, your contribution to it from wherever you are, regardless of whether it is directly with the OSCE Secretariat or not. I see one question on Facebook, and then I'm being told, how long do I have?
10 minutes more.
I have 10 minutes, I am told. I see a question, therefore, that was asked apparently on Facebook from Technology. Okay, I think that's the company name. Yes. Technology Wata. which says, as a startup tech company, Wata, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name, technology is working to raise 24/7 awareness, especially among African youth, to keep them informed and empowered. However, to fully achieve this vision and make a real impact, the company faces financial challenges. What strategies or experiences can you share to help secure the necessary funding to support a startup's growth and long-term vision? This is a crucial question, Wata. The truth is, I am not myself a venture capitalist or an expert in fundraising for startups. But I think that what I can address from your question, which I hope you will find some use in, is multiple things. First, I think that as countries, we must start working together to create the necessary juridical, legal, and policy frameworks that enable not only the fostering of our startup ecosystems, but also to create the necessary secondary markets, which is precisely what you are speaking about, which is in order to raise funds as a startup, you must see the existence of a secondary market that attracts very different kinds of investors than what other businesses attract. The other aspect, the second thing, is that as countries, we must work towards pooling our resources to ensure that we have accelerators and incubators at a more regional level, to ensure that our startups get the necessary support in business development as well as in securing funds, and having the visibility necessary to have economies of scale. But the third is also something that I believe must be undertaken at the global south level. And this is where one of the concrete initiatives of the OSCE is. And that is the endeavor to make, first, our startups more visible internationally so that they can have strategic partnerships that enables them to grow. Second, to bring our startups together, whether they are round A funding, round B, or at the 40th round of funding, that is big and small, on a platform where they can exchange and learn from each other. And this is, I say this is something we are doing from the OSCE for the very simple reason that we are launching the first edition of the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology, which will happen in December this year. It was initially scheduled earlier, but we decided to postpone it to give our startups more time to apply to be part of GRESFET. And this fair, this Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies or Homegrown Technologies, is providing exhibition space for our, in addition to panel discussions and other more regular sessions, to provide exhibition space to our youth, to our startups, to showcase the work that they do. You cannot expect funding if you are not visible enough. And this is a way to do so. So GRESFET will take place in early December, on the 2nd and 3rd of December here in Addis Ababa in collaboration with the Ministry of Innovation and Technology. In this regard, I do invite you as a startup that I assume is in one of our countries to also consider attending GRESFET and circulating it amongst your networks. I hope that I've answered your question. If I haven't, feel free to challenge a bit. I see we have another question from Sydney, and I did say to Sydney that if he was unsatisfied by my answer, to challenge me, and I am a man of my word. So Sydney says, thank you for the answers. Yet in terms of engagement, it is still the backbone of action. Even the All Africa Student Union you mentioned attended these seminars and conferences. It would be good for OSCE to be at these events, for they can't work in silos for collective action. I would encourage it attends these conferences. To your presence and absence is being felt. I welcome this, Sydney. And let me tell you one thing. we never reject opportunities to attend conferences organized by other institutions, because we believe that the voice of the OSCE is important there. My answer was more about why is my emphasis as Secretary General not on conferences and seminars. That being said, and I will speak to you transparently, because I, and my chief of staff that I always say is mistreating me, is actually the one trying to calm me down. Whenever we receive invitations, I try to the very best of my ability to attend them, even if it means traveling 30 hours and being back and going to a meeting immediately. Because I do believe that it is important to engage. But I'm saying I will speak to you transparently because it is my duty to speak transparently. Because otherwise, this exercise is worthless. I will speak with you transparently. And transparently, I will say that we will never reject invitations unless it is logistically impossible to attend conferences, to engage, but that we also hope to receive more invitations. Do we have any other question? I hope I've answered you. I'm being told I have 5 minutes. No, I don't see any other questions. Very well. So in this regard, I think this concludes this 5th episode of the Third Way Live with the SG. Despite the technical problem, I think it has been a fruitful one because I think that your comments, your views, and your proposals and critiques, I think of you, Sydney, have been most valuable to us. And we look forward to continuing this dynamic, continuing this endeavor of engaging with you more directly, of continuing our concrete actions towards a third way of development, of seeing you all as the protagonists of this endeavor, and of coming together, not only every Sunday for this session, but above all, para que así, entre todos, logramos lo que era un imposible, que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. So that we, this way, together, all of us, can achieve what was once thought to be impossible, that the entire world may know that the South also exists.